For most Americans, middle class is more than an income category. It's an aspiration.
The president has said his tax plan is a middle-class miracle.
President Trump could declare a national emergency to tackle sky-high home prices.
At the end of the day, President Trump's tariff policies are about affecting the working class.
I mean, middle class, right? The foundation of our economy.
In 1970, the average American worker could do something that sounds like a fantasy today. He could walk into a factory with a high school diploma, earn a single paycheck, buy a 3-bedroom house, put his wife through nursing school if she wanted, own 2 cars, take the kids to Disneyland every summer, and retire at 62 with a pension that paid him until the day he died. That man's grandson is 34 years old now. He has a bachelor's degree and $41,000 in student loan debt. He and his wife both work full-time. Together, they earn $105,000 a year, which, by every definition, makes them middle class. But they rent a 2-bedroom apartment. They have $11,000 in savings. Their health insurance deductible is $2,000, and their childcare bill is $1,400 a month, more than their car payments combined. They have not taken a real vacation in 3 years. By every measure of consumption, the phones in their pockets, the streaming services on their television, the safety of their car, they live better than kings did a century ago. But by every measure of security, the equity in their home, their ability to survive a job loss, their confidence that tomorrow will be better than today, they are falling behind, and they know it. 65% of middle-class Americans say they are struggling financially. 77% say middle-class life is harder than it was a generation ago. Only 21% expect their financial situation to improve anytime soon. The middle class, the group of Americans that politicians on both sides of the aisle swear they exist to protect, is not dying from a single wound. It is being slowly suffocated by a stack of forces that no single policy, no single president, and no single party created. Housing, healthcare, education, childcare, debt, stagnant wages, and a tax code that everyone agrees is broken but no one will fix. This is the story how the most prosperous middle class in human history found itself unable to afford the life it was promised. What actually happened? Who did this? And is there any way back? Before we can talk about what's happening to the middle class, we need to actually define who they really are.
So many people have come up to me and say, give it to the middle class. Give it to people that need it. Give it to people that want to spend it.
He's trying to tell us he cares about the middle class. Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
In the middle class today are trying desperately to survive.
The wealth of our middle class has been ripped.
Economists typically draw the line at households earning between 2/3 and double the national median income. In 2023, for a family of 3, that meant roughly $61,000 to $183,000 a year. But the middle class was never really about a number. It was about a deal. You work hard, you play by the rules, you can afford a home, raise a family, send your kids to college, and retire without fear. That deal is what's breaking. In 1971, 61% of American adults lived in middle-class households. By 2023, that number had fallen to 51%. The middle-class share of total national income dropped from 62% to just 42% over the same period. Meanwhile, the top 1% doubled their share of income from 9% to 18%. And if there is a single chart that explains why the middle class feels doomed, it's the one showing home prices versus incomes. In 1985, the median home cost 3.6 times the median household income. That's a ratio that meant a normal family with a reasonable down payment could buy a house. By 2023, that ratio had climbed to 5.3 times income. In some cities, it's 7, 8, or 9 times. And here's the raw math. From 1985 to 2023, median household income grew 241%. Home prices grew 408%. Adjust for inflation, and incomes went up 8.5%, while home prices surged over 56%. The result? As of 2025, nearly 75% of American households cannot afford a median-priced new home. In 23 states and Washington, D.C., more than 80% are priced out. The median age for a first-time home buyer has hit 40 years old, up from 28 in 1991. and the share of first-time buyers has collapsed to a record low of 21%. This is not just about expensive cities anymore. The affordability crisis has hit rural America, where buyers now need nearly double the income they needed before the pandemic to afford a typical home. Mortgage rates that had sat at a historic low of 2.96% in 2021 spiked to nearly 8% by late 2023. That effectively doubled the monthly mortgage payment on the same house from about $1,100 to $2,200. And here's the trap. Homeowners who locked in those ultra-low rates have no incentive to sell. Why would you give up a 3% mortgage to buy at 7%? This lock-it effect has frozen the market, choking inventory and keeping prices elevated even as demand softens. Young families are stuck renting, unable to build the equity that was once the backbone of middle-class wealth. And if housing is the barrier to entering the middle class, healthcare is the constant tax on staying there. The United States spends more on healthcare per person than any country on Earth, roughly $14,900 per capita in 2024. That is more than double the average of comparable wealthy nations. Total national health spending hit $5.3 trillion, consuming 18% of the entire economy. For a middle-class family, the average employer-sponsored health insurance premium reached nearly $27,000 in 2025 for family coverage. The employee share alone was about $6,850, and that's before deductibles. The average single coverage deductible hit $1,886, with a third of workers facing deductibles above $2,000. Family health premiums have surged over 25% since 2020 alone. And then there's the catastrophic risk. 100 million Americans carry a combined $220 billion in medical debt. Roughly 2/3 of all personal bankruptcies in this country are linked to medical bills or illness-related income loss. That statistic is virtually non-existent in other developed nations. An American middle-class family is one bad diagnosis away from financial ruin, and everybody knows it. And then looking back, a college degree used to be a ladder into the middle class. Now it's more like a toll booth. You can't get in without paying, and the price just keeps going up. Average in-state tuition at a public four-year university was $804 in 1980. By 2025, it was $10,340, an increase of over 1,100%. Tuition inflation has consistently outpaced both general inflation and wage growth by a wide margin. In 1980, a student needed about 259 hours of minimum wage work to cover a year of public university tuition. Today, that same math requires roughly 1,426 hours. That is 5.5 times more labor for the same product, partly because tuition exploded and partly because the federal minimum wage has been frozen at $7.25 since 2009. Total outstanding student loan debt in the United States now stands at approximately $1.8 trillion across nearly 43 million federal borrowers. The average balance is about $39,500 per borrower. 3.6 million people owe more than $100,000 each, and 83% of millennials with student debt say they postpone major financial milestones, buying a house, getting married, having children, because of what they owe. And then there's the cost that has turned the single-income household from normal to nearly extinct: childcare. The national average for center-based childcare hit $13,128 per child in 2024, which is more than annual public university tuition. For 2 children, center-based care averages $28,168, consuming roughly 35% of median household income. In 45 states plus Washington, D.C., childcare for 2 children exceeds annual mortgage payments. 17% of parents have left the workforce entirely because of childcare costs. 27% have cut their hours. 19% have gone into debt just to cover care. The Department of Health and Human Services defines affordable childcare as no more than 7% of income. Almost nobody hits that number. All of these cost explosions might be survivable if wages had kept pace. They didn't. From 1948 to 1973, hourly compensation for typical workers rose 91%, almost perfectly matching 97% productivity growth. Workers produced more, and they earned more. The deal held. Then the line split. From 1973 to 2024, productivity kept climbing, up roughly 71%, but median hour wage compensation grew only about 29%. The average hourly wage today has roughly the same purchasing power as it had in 1978. Nearly half a century of economic growth, and the typical worker's paycheck barely moved. Where did the money go? It went up. The top 1% of earners saw cumulative wage gains of 158% from 1979 to 2018. The bottom 90% gained 24%. The share of gross domestic income going to employee wages and benefits fell from 58% in 1980 to 51% by 2025. Corporate profits rose from 6% to nearly 12% of GDP over the same period. Calculated out, that means the average American worker is bringing home roughly $12,000 less per year than they would if the labor capital split had stayed where it was in 1980. Across all workers, that represents approximately $2 trillion in annual compensation that shifted from labor to capital. And here's what this all looks like in a single household budget. Essentials, which is housing, food, transportation, and healthcare, now consume approximately 71% of total household spending. That leaves less than 29% for everything else: savings, education, entertainment, emergencies. The typical American household spends nearly $79,000 a year. The margin for error is gone. 42% of Americans lack confidence they could cover a $5,000 emergency. Credit card debt hit an all-time record of $1.27 trillion at the end of 2025, with the average interest rates at 22.3%. Total household debt across all categories reached $18.8 trillion. This is why middle-class Americans are selling their blood plasma to make ends meet. This is why 36 to 45% of Americans report having a side hustle. This is why 61% say their life would be unaffordable without that extra income. The middle class is not living. It is surviving. This subject matter can be hard to digest, but for most Americans, their personal financial situation is the hardest subject to approach and manage. But with the Dollarwise budgeting app, you can finally take control, and since there's a free trial, you can see for yourself, get a full picture, automate your budget, get powerful insights, and set real goals that change your life. Download Dollarwise or go to dollarwise.com. To understand the crisis, you have to understand the miracle that came before it. The period from 1945 to 1973 was the greatest sustained expansion of middle-class prosperity in human history, and it was built on conditions that are never coming back. The United States emerged from World War II as the only major industrial economy with its factories still standing. Europe and Japan were rubble. American workers had a temporary monopoly on global manufacturing. The GI Bill sent 2.3 million veterans to college and backed over 4 million home loans by 1956. Homeownership surged from 44% to 62% in 2 decades. Union membership peaked at nearly 35%. Real family income roughly doubled across every income level. Productivity and wages rose in lockstep. This era embedded an expectation that a single earner with a high school diploma could own a home, support a family, and retire with a pension. That has proven to be historically unusual, not a natural baseline the economy returns to on its own. Starting in the 1970s, manufacturing jobs, the backbone of the post-war middle class, began moving overseas. The number of manufacturing jobs peaked at 19.6 million in 1979 and fell to 12.3 million by 2010. China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 accelerated the trend dramatically. Researchers estimate approximately 985,000 manufacturing jobs were lost directly and indirectly from Chinese imports between 1999 and 2011 alone. The trade-off was real. Chinese imports reduced consumer prices significantly, an estimated savings of about $411,000 per lost manufacturing job. Cheaper goods at Walmart, but the costs were geographically concentrated and devastating to specific communities. That persisted for 2 decades. Entire towns hollowed out. An MIT study found that automation has been the primary driver of income equality since 1980, replacing mostly less educated workers in routine tasks. Between 2000 and 2020, automation eliminated approximately 1.7 million manufacturing jobs, while generating 2.8 million positions in technology and healthcare. The jobs that disappeared were in the middle of the income distribution. The ones that replaced them were at the top and the bottom. The middle hollowed out. Middle-skilled jobs declined from 58% of employment in 1981 to 44% by 2011. Labor force participation for non-college educated men aged 25 to 54 fell by 6.3 percentage points from 1990 to 2023. These men didn't just lose their jobs. Many of them left the workforce entirely. The third force is subtler, but arguably the most powerful: the financialization of the American economy. Capital gains, not wages, became the primary driver of income divergence at the top. The top 0.1%'s wealth shares surged from roughly 7% in the late 70s to over 12% by the 2010s. Every time there was a crisis, 2001, 2008, 2020, the Federal Reserve responded by slashing interest rates and pumping money into the financial system through quantitative easing. This inflated asset prices: stocks, real estate, bonds. And since the wealthy owned most of these assets, the policy disproportionately benefited the top 10%. The middle class, which relies on wages rather than capital gains, watched the cost of their biggest asset, housing, rise faster than their paycheck. The Bank of England found that 40% of quantitative easing gains went to the richest 5%. And then union membership in the private sector fell from roughly 35% in the 1950s to about 6% today. This removed the critical mechanism that had historically channeled productivity gains into worker wages. When Reagan fired 11,345 striking air traffic controllers in 1981, it sent a signal that reshaped American labor relations for a generation.
At one point in these negotiations, agreement was reached and signed by both sides.
Major strikes averaged 289 per year in the 70s. By the 90s, that number was 35. The shift from employer-guaranteed pensions to self-directed 401k plans quietly transferred enormous financial risk onto individuals. In the early 80s, 60% of private sector retirement contributions went to defined benefit pension plans. Today, only 4% of private sector workers have a traditional pension as their sole retirement plan. And there's a separate structural failure that deserves its own discussion, because it cuts across political lines. The American housing market is broken, not primarily because of the demand, but because of supply. Local zoning regulations, single-family mandates, height limits, parking minimums, and what is politely called NIMBY sentiment have strangled housing construction for decades. Excessive zoning has pushed real house prices 56% above construction costs. America needs an estimated 6.8 million new housing units, and we are building roughly half of what's required. This is not a left versus right issue. NIMBY sentiment cuts across party lines. Wealthy homeowners in blue states and red states alike fight new construction because it might change their neighborhood or lower their property values. The result is that Americans cannot move where the best jobs are because housing in those areas is prohibitive. This is one of the largest drags on economic mobility in the country. And let's be clear about something. Both political parties contributed to this situation. Republican-led policies cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 28% during the Reagan presidency. The supply-side argument had real merit. Individual income tax revenues rose, inflation dropped from about 10% to under 4%, and unemployment fell. But the Gini coefficient, the standard measure of inequality, began a sustained rise from roughly 0.35 in the late 70s to nearly 0.49 by 2021. The national debt tripled. The CEO to worker pay ratio expanded from 31 to 1 in 1978 to 281 to 1 by 2024. Corporate tax cuts were made permanent, while individual tax provisions expire after 2025. Democratic-led policies expanded safety nets and subsidies but failed to address the structural cost drivers. Federal student loan availability arguably incentivized universities to raise tuition. The Affordable Care Act expanded coverage but did not fundamentally bend the healthcare cost curve. Regulatory costs passed through as higher prices. Neither party has reformed the Social Security payroll tax cap, closed the carried interest loophole, or passed genuine bipartisan tax reform since 1986, nearly 40 years ago. The middle class was not betrayed by one party. It was neglected by both. And everything you just heard is true, and everything you are about to hear is also true. Both things can be real at the same time. That's what makes this story so complicated. A modern smartphone replaces technology that would have cost an estimated $32 million in 1985. A color television that cost the equivalent of $8,000 in the early 70s now costs $300 to $500 and is incomparably better. Computing power that cost nearly $19 million per gigaflop in 1984 costs 3 cents today. Streaming services provide virtually unlimited entertainment for $8 to $16 a month. In 1995, a 3-minute coast-to-coast phone call cost the equivalent of over $500 in today's money. Now it's essentially free. Americans today have approximately 63% more purchasing power than they did in 1973. Median income has risen over 1,000% since then, while the Consumer Price Index has risen 586%. Clothing that has once consumed 10 to 12% of household income now takes about 3%. Gas adjusted for inflation has actually decreased since 9% since 1973. The catch, and it's a big one, is that all of the surplus purchasing power has been eaten up by the big three: housing, education, and healthcare. The middle class can buy more stuff than ever, but it cannot afford the milestones that define middle class life. And here's something that nobody talks about. America is dramatically safer than it used to be. The violent crime rate fell 49% between 1993 and 2022. By the Bureau of Justice Statistics measure, violent and property crime both dropped 71%. Robberies are down 74%. Burglaries are down 75%. Homicides in 2024 were 16% lower than in 2023, and 6% below pre-pandemic levels. Property crime hit its lowest level in at least 48 years. Motor vehicle deaths per mile driven have fallen over 93% since the 1920s. Workplace fatalities dropped from roughly 14,000 annually in 1975 to 283 in 2023, despite employment nearly tripling. Crime did spike during 2020 and 2021, but that spike has largely been reversed. The long-term trajectory is powerful, unmistakably downward. Now, the American healthcare system is outrageously expensive. That is established, but the medicine itself is extraordinary. Overall 5-year cancer survival rates has improved from 49% in the mid-70s to 70% for recent diagnoses, averting an estimated 4.8 million cancer deaths since 1991. Childhood leukemia survival went from under 10% in the 60s to roughly 9% today. HIV went from a death sentence to a manageable chronic condition. Hepatitis C became curable in over 95% of cases. Life expectancy reached a record high of 79 years in 2024, recovering from the COVID-era dip. Drug overdose deaths saw their largest decline ever recorded, dropping 26% between 2023 and 2024. Fentanyl-related deaths fell nearly 36%. The opioid crisis is not over, but it is retreating. And one of the most genuinely encouraging developments in the American economy right now is happening at the ground level. The United States averaged 430,000 new business applications per month in 2024, 50% more than in 2019. Over 19 million new business applications have been filed since the end of 2020. The country now has 36.2 million small businesses, representing 99.9% of all firms and about 46% of private sector employment. Small businesses contributed nearly 53% of net job creation between 2021 and 2024. Entrepreneurs are more diverse than ever. 43% of the self-employed are women, a record, and Black, Asian, and Hispanic shares are near all-time highs. The tools available to entrepreneurs today, zero commission investing, fractional shares, Shopify stores for $29 a month, global distribution through social media, have lowered the barriers to building wealth outside the traditional employer-employee framework. Before COVID, only about 5 to 7% of paid workers were remote. Today, approximately 25% are, more than 3 times the pre-pandemic level. 35% of workers with remote-capable jobs now work from home full-time. This has enabled something genuinely new: geographic arbitrage is scale. A worker earning a San Francisco salary can live in Boise or Nashville, saving hundreds of thousands of dollars over a career and housing costs alone. Remote workers save an average of 40 minutes a day in commuting time, the equivalent of nearly 3.5 work weeks per year. California lost roughly 1.46 million residents through domestic migration from 2020 to 2024. Texas gained about 2 million. Florida added nearly 500,000. South Carolina led all states in growth rate. The pattern is clear. People are moving from high-cost, high-tax states to lower-cost alternatives. And while the politics of that migration are complicated, the economics are straightforward. And here's the data point that complicates the entire middle class is dying narrative. The middle class is shrinking in both directions, and the upward movement is significant. Using inflation-adjusted income thresholds, the upper middle class boomed from 10% of families in 1979 to 31% in 2024. For the first time ever, there are now more American families above the middle class income level, 35%, than below it, 34%. Median middle class income rose from $66,400 in 1970 to $106,100 in 2022 in constant dollars. That does not erase the pain for those being squeezed, but it does mean the story is more complicated than a simple decline. A lot of people moved up. Take a moment and get some free, easy money. With a Chime checking account and my link, you can get $350 when you set up direct deposit and pair that with a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. There's literally no reason not to sign up right now. Chime.com/Caleb or link in the description below. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to run dry by 2033, possibly 2032. When it does, benefits will automatically be cut to 77% of scheduled levels. For a typical retiring couple, that represents roughly $18,400 per year just gone. The 75-year unfunded obligation stands at approximately $25 trillion. The worker-to-beneficiary ratio has fallen from 5 to 1 in 1960 to about 3 to 1 today and is headed below 2.5 to 1 by mid-century. Neither party has been honest with voters about this. It'll require either benefit cuts, tax increases, or some combination. And the longer the delay, the more painful the adjustment. And then there's artificial intelligence, which may be the largest disruption of the labor workforce since industrialization. And unlike previous waves of automation, which primarily hit blue-collar factory workers, this one is aimed squarely at the white-collar middle class. Goldman Sachs projects AI could automate 25% of work tasks in the US and Europe, potentially displacing the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs globally. McKinsey estimates 12 million Americans may need to switch occupations by 2030. White-collar roles score only 68 out of 100 on AI-resistant scales, while skilled trades, electricians, plumbers, welders, score 91. The irony is striking. The jobs that were supposed to be safe, the ones you went to college for, may be more threatened than the ones you didn't. Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei has warned that AI could eliminate half of all entry-level white-collar jobs and spike unemployment to 10 to 20% within 5 years. Whether that proves accurate or alarmist, the direction is clear. AI is not coming for truck drivers first. It is coming for analysts, coders, customer service agents, and middle managers. Add all that with the federal debt held by the public, which stands at approximately $30 trillion, which is 100% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office projects this will rise to 118% by 2035, surpassing the World War II record. Net interest payments already hit $1 trillion annually in 2025. By 2036, the government will be spending more on interest than on defense. By 2035, interest alone will consume 28% of total federal revenue, nearly $1 for every 5 in taxes paying for past borrowing, not current services. This constrains everything. Whether you want tax cuts or new programs, a debt spiral makes both harder. It crowds out investment, it pushes interest rates higher, and ultimately, it is a bill that the middle class will have to pay one way or another. Because the total fertility rate in the United States dropped to a record low of 1.6 children per woman in 2024, well below the 2.1 replacement rate. The CBO projects the population will stop growing entirely by 2056 and begin shrinking. Deaths are projected to exceed births starting in 2031. Fewer workers supporting more retirees, more pressure on Social Security, more pressure on Medicaid, less economic dynamism. Without immigration, the population would begin declining by 2030. This is not a political opinion, it's arithmetic. Now, the era of maximally free trade appears to be over. Both parties support some degree of protectionism and industrial policy. The current tariff regime is projected to raise consumer prices by about 2.3% in the short term, equivalent to a loss of roughly $3,800 per household. The Penn Wharton budget model projects tariffs will reduce long-run GDP by about 6% and wages by 5%. The counter-argument is real. Tariffs protect domestic industries, may incentivize reshoring, generate significant federal revenue, and serve as leverage in trade negotiations. But the near-term cost falls disproportionately on the middle class and working class. Because tariffs are effectively a consumption tax, and lower-income households spend a greater share of income on goods. But it is not all darkness. Several forces could work in the middle class's favor. Housing reform, while agonizingly slow, is happening. Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning. Oregon legalized duplexes statewide. Multiple states have passed ADU reforms. The politics of housing supply are shifting because the crisis is now too large to ignore. If zoning reform accelerates, it could unlock the single most important lever for middle-class affordability. The skilled trades represent a genuine path forward. The construction industry needs 439,000 new workers in 2025 alone. The country is projected to be 550,000 plumbers short by 2027. Skilled trades wages have risen over 20% since early 2020, with electricians in top-paying states earning $85,000 to $88,000 and master electricians exceeding $100,000. These are middle-class careers that do not require a 4-year degree, cannot be outsourced, and are highly resistant to AI. The trades may be the most underrated economic opportunity in America right now. AI itself, if managed well, could unleash a productivity boom. The Warren budget model predicts AI will increase productivity and GDP by 1.5% by 2035, nearly 3% by 2055, and 3.7% by 2075. If those gains are broadly shared, a big if, they could fund the entitlement reforms and public investments that the middle class needs. And the great wealth transfer is coming. An estimated $124 trillion is projected to pass from baby boomers to younger generations through 2048. But this is a double-edged sword. The transfer is extraordinarily concentrated. The top 1.5% to 2% of households will account for roughly half of all transfers. More than half of boomers plan to not leave an inheritance at all. This will stratify the middle class further. Those who inherit will pull ahead, and those who don't will fall behind. This is not just an American story. Middle class pressure is rising across the developed world. The UK's real wages have been stagnant for 15 years. Germany's manufacturing base is under severe pressure from energy costs and Chinese competition. Canada's housing crisis rivals or exceeds America's in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Japan has been fighting demographic decline and economic stagnation for 3 decades. But some countries are doing things differently. Many European nations provide universal healthcare, subsidized childcare, and free or near-free higher education, eliminating 3 of the 4 major cost categories that crush the American middle class. They pay for it with higher taxes and, in some cases, slower growth. The Nordic countries consistently rank highest on social mobility. Raj Shetty's research found that the chances of achieving the American dream are almost now twice as high in Canada as in the United States. That does not mean the European model is the answer. Many European nations face their own affordability crisis, aging populations, and sluggish economies. But it does suggest that the American approach, privatizing the cost of healthcare, education, and childcare while wages stagnate, is producing uniquely bad outcomes for middle-class families by international standards. The American middle class is not dead, but the math has changed beyond recognition. We traded security for abundance. We traded low-cost, small-scale housing for high-cost, high-regulation housing. We traded the stability of manufacturing for the dynamism and inequality of the knowledge economy. We traded the single-earner model for the dual-earner necessity. We traded pensions for the 401ks and told people to figure it out themselves. The result is a society that is materially comfortable but psychologically anxious. A family can have a 65-inch 4K television and feel impoverished because they cannot afford a house in a safe school district. A worker can earn 6 figures and still live paycheck to paycheck because housing, childcare, and health insurance consume everything. The honest, centrist answer is that both the optimist and the pessimist have the data on their side. The optimist can point to rising real incomes, falling crime, record entrepreneurship, cheaper consumer goods, and a booming upper middle class. The pessimist can point to housing, education, healthcare, the labor share decline, student debt, and the national debt. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is the convergence of AI disruption with fiscal unsustainability. 2 forces that, unmanaged, could dramatically accelerate middle-class erosion. But it is also a moment of genuine opportunity. If policy can address the housing supply crisis, manage the AI transition to augment rather than replace workers, and impose some financial discipline, the underlying economic engine remains powerful enough to produce broadly shared prosperity. The question is not whether America is rich enough to support a thriving middle class. It clearly is. The question is whether the political system is capable of making the structural reforms that would let that happen. Zoning reform, healthcare cost transparency, skill-based hiring, Social Security modernization, policies that enable mobility and entrepreneurship rather than protecting incumbents. These solutions are boring. They are incremental. They are politically difficult, and they are the only things that will actually work. The old formula, get a degree, get a job, buy a house, retire at 65, requires either far higher income, far lower costs, or a fundamentally different approach to building economic security than the one Americans have been told to follow. The middle class is not impossible, but the old path to it is. The question for the next 2 decades is whether America builds a new one.